Alright, this lesson is called How Do We Know What We Know? And let's start with this. Samuel Shenton was a sign maker in England in the middle of the 20th century. But he didn't get famous for making signs. His fame came from his belief that the earth is flat instead of round. He had detailed charts and elaborate models to explain everything about his theory. He even gave lectures and held meetings to advance his ideas. And then in 1956, he founded the Flat Earth Society to boost the credibility of what he was talking about. Eventually, when he was confronted with pictures of the Earth that were taken from space, he dismissed those pictures as fake. Samuel Shenton believed that the Earth is flat, and no amount of evidence could convince him that it wasn't. The story of Samuel Shenton brings the question of this lesson into focus. How do we know what we know? Or you could spin it a different way. Why do we believe what we believe? A theologian named John Stackhouse gives an answer to this question that I think is exactly right. He says, "You cannot believe what you do not have adequate grounds, that is, what to you are adequate grounds to believe." To state it positively, you believe what you believe because you're convinced that you have good enough reasons to believe it. If you weren't convinced that you had sufficient grounds to believe something, you wouldn't believe it. It's that simple. But notice how Stackhouse has qualified his statement about adequate grounds with the words, "to you." What you and I think counts as adequate grounds might not be the same thing. That's why two people might disagree about what's actually believable. Now, at this point, it's reasonable to ask if a person can believe something without adequate grounds. After all, there are a lot of people who believe things that, to me, seem to be unfounded. Does that undermine Stackhouse's claim? I think the answer is no, as long as we keep Stackhouse's qualification intact. The grounds must be adequate to the individual doing the believing, and we can test this by considering the case of Santa Claus. Why do children believe in Santa? A few ideas come to mind. One is that their parents told them that Santa is real. Also, movies reinforce the claim that Santa is real. Kids go and sit on Santa's lap at stores in the weeks leading up to Christmas morning. Google provides a Santa tracker that allows children to track Santa's movements around the globe on Christmas Eve. And finally, when a child wakes up on Christmas morning, the cookies are gone and presents are under the tree. On their own or combined, these things provide what children perceive to be adequate grounds for believing in Santa. That's why they believe. But you don't believe in Santa, do you? Of course not. Neither do I. That's because somewhere along the way, you and I stopped seeing those factors that I just talked about as constituting adequate grounds for belief. It occurred to us that our parents' claims, Christmas movies, Santa impersonators, Santa trackers, and missing cookies were inadequate grounds for believing in Santa. Or maybe the whole charade stopped when your parents finally told you that Santa wasn't real. Either way, our adequate grounds for believing in Santa became inadequate. That means they were replaced by adequate grounds for disbelieving in Santa, and that is when we stopped believing. Now, it might surprise you to learn that the same thing can happen when it comes to Christian faith. If you don't believe that you have adequate grounds to believe the claims of Christian faith, you won't believe. It's that simple. You believe something when you encounter what you perceive to be adequate grounds for that belief. That's how it works. And that brings us to the key question. How do we know what we know? This question takes us into the subject of epistemology. It's a field of study within philosophy that addresses how we know things. Now, just so you understand, epistemology is a very complex subject that could be explored in far more detail than what I'm going to do here, but it definitely needs to be discussed at least briefly at this point. You might be familiar with the quote from Master Chuang of China. In the 4th century BC, he asked, "If when I am asleep I am a man dreaming I am a butterfly, how do I know when I am awake that I am not a butterfly dreaming I am a man?" This idea is common in Eastern conceptions of the world. The idea is that what you see is an illusion. It's not really real. And so life then is basically like being stuck with Leonardo DiCaprio in the movie Inception. It's like a dream within a dream that only feels like it's real. And even as that movie ends, if you've ever seen it, you know this, it's hard to tell if what you're seeing is the real world or another dream world. Christian faith moves in a different direction. What you see, according to Christian faith, is not an illusion, it's reality. This is an outlook known as realism. It's the belief that we have reliable access to reality. Christian philosopher Os Guinness explains that in strong contrast to the Eastern views, the Christian view has a solid appreciation of the created reality that we know and that we may trust. But, and this is important, even though Christians and other realists believe that we have trustworthy access to reality, we also have to recognize our limitations. One limitation is that we're finite. As finite human beings, we're limited to bodies in specific times and places. We don't possess an all-seeing eye. We aren't capable of knowing everything there is to know. And even if we could know everything there is to know about a particular subject or problem, we'd have no way of knowing that we actually knew everything there is to know about that subject or problem. That's why John Stackhouse cautions us to beware of overestimating the reliability of what we think we know. Another limitation is that we're fallen. According to Christian theology, our thoughts, perceptions, and choices have been disordered by sin. It's like sin creates a reality distortion field that clouds our vision and skews our judgment. As a result, Stackhouse says that we are inclined in certain respects both to perceive things wrongly and to process what we perceive wrongly as well. Because of these two factors, our finitude and our fallenness, we should include a healthy dose of skepticism about our realism. In other words, we have to practice a kind of critical realism. So from the perspective of critical realism, how do we know what we know? Well, the simplest way to answer that question is to say that we rely on authorities. An authority is someone or something that we rely on to describe or define reality for us. Whenever a person claims to know something, you can find out what serves as their authority for that knowledge by asking a single question. And that question is, how do you know that? Whatever the person says in response to that question is what serves as that person's authority. And if you disagree with the person's claim, it's usually because you attribute a lower level of trustworthiness to the authority that they've cited. So how do we know what we know? We rely on sources of authority. But that's not all there is to say about this, because there are actually 4 specific sources of authority that inform our sense of knowledge. And it's important that we learn how to balance those sources, and that's what the next lesson is all about.